Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Incidentally Informed. This time we will be looking at the ransomware landscape in Canada. We are joined by a wonderful group of panelists who can help us look at this from a forensic, legal and insurance perspective. My name is Louise Jose. I'm the marketing coordinator here at CyberClan. And as I said, today I'm joined by a brilliant bunch of panelists who I will introduce you to shortly. But first, I'd like to give you a quick overview about CyberClan, who we are and what we do. So over the years, CyberClan has helped thousands of clients through cyber incident. We're based in the United States, United Kingdom and Canada, enabling us to offer global services to victims of attack and industry partners alike. So I will now introduce you to our fabulous panelists. If we can go to gallery view. Fabulous. Okay, so today we are joined by Dwayne Robinson, who is our Global Director of Incident Response here at CyberClan, Greg Markell, who's President and CEO of Ridge Canada, and Travis Walker, Associate at Dolden Walker Follick. So if I could ask each of you to tell us a bit about yourselves, that'd be fabulous. Dwayne, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks, Liz. Welcome everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Dwayne Robinson. I am the Global Director of the Incident Response team here at CyberClan. So my team spans Canada, US, and England. Like the name states, we do help clients that are victim of a incident/breach. I wish we got them ahead of time more often, but usually the damage, unfortunately, has already been done by the time they call us. But thanks everybody for joining, and looking forward to this.
Fantastic. Greg.
Perfect. I'll echo Dwayne's sentiments because I work, directly with organizations just like CyberClan and Dolden Wallace and Follick. So I get the great and distinct pleasure of working with Travis and Dwayne and their colleagues when our clients get hit. But I run Ridge Canada Cyber Solutions. It is a managing general agency. We've grown our portfolio in cyber insurance. We're one of the largest cyber insurance providers in Canada. At this point, we're at about 700 clients and counting, and all we do is cyber insurance right now. We're expanding into some other product lines, but in my role as the president and CEO, I oversee a team of underwriters, and we also work directly with our team of claims experts from different organizations. And I know we're going to get into this, so I will pass the mic over to Travis because the lawyers are always the first people that people should call. And so Travis, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Greg and Dwayne, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, depending where you're dialing in from. Thank you for joining us. So I'm an associate in the privacy and cybersecurity group at Dolden Wallace Follick. I'm based in Toronto. We're a specialty lines insurance firm with a presence all across Canada. So I started in the cyber privacy field when I joined DWF in 2019, so somewhat recently, but since then I've been working with CyberClan. They were NTL when I started anyway, but we worked with them since I started on a number of breach incidents. Many of which are increasingly ransomware, but we've sort of spanned the gamut of them together, and are lucky to have great clients like Greg and other insurers who retain us to help do some damage control and try to provide a little insight on the law side of things. So we're only typically brought in when the damage has been done, but it's something that we specialize in and the firm has been doing for a long time, and it's a really big growth area for us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So everyone who's joined us so far, we will be doing a question and answer session at the end. So if you do have any questions that come up during the discussion, please feel free to fill them out in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we'll try and answer as many as we possibly can at the end of our discussion. So firstly, I'd like to pose a quick question to Greg to get things going. One of the things I was most interested in was the number of insurance policies for cyber insurance being taken out in Canada, are we seeing an increase in that at the moment?
Yeah, the total number of policies outstanding is a little bit of a difficult item to nail down. We do have some statistics, but they're a little bit dated. And it was from a survey that StatsCan ran in 2017 before mandatory notification requirements came in November 1, 2018. But they did a survey and they actually got an 86% response ratio. It's been a year or two since I've quoted these statistics, so they're off the top of my head, so bear with me. I might be a little bit anecdotal in them. But on the 86% response rate, what they did was they broke it down into small, medium, and enterprise and large, which is how StatsCan actually does the quantification of different Canadian businesses. And the purchasing rates of cyber insurance among those tranches were 24% for large enterprise, 14% mid-market, and then 7% for small. But when you distill down those numbers a little bit further, some of the things StatsCan actually asked some specific questions, one of which was, do you have certain lines of coverage within the policy itself? And so when I break it down and I look at those numbers, what I see is that about 67% of those survey respondents that indicated that they were buying standalone coverage didn't have certain coverage elements, which means that of those numbers, about 2/3 are actually buying real standalone cyber policies. I think that applies more to the small side, that with like just throw-in coverages that you could buy off of an insurance package policy. But the Canadian market has been growing. 2019, the total market size, according to OSFI, those numbers was about 135 million in written premium. Fast forward to 2020, and those numbers jumped to about 222 million. Through 2 quarters of 2021, it looked like the numbers, again, most of the bot purchasing activity is in Q3, Q4, so those numbers still aren't out yet. But through 2 quarters in 2021, there was about a 22% growth factor in terms of written premium in Canada. So we still have a few issues. We don't have full scale for the limits that are out there and for the premiums that have come in. We have a demand. Demand has been increasing for cyber insurance policies in Canada, but as a result of the claims activity, and I'll just give the OSFI numbers on those. So for 2019, it was about 117 million. And if you look at that as your numerator and the total written premium as your denominator, it gives you a pretty good idea of whether or not the insurers are making underwriting income. And on 117, these are net numbers. So, you know, you have to gross them up. So in 2019, the industry didn't make any money. It lost some money from an underwriting perspective. How much is, you know, a little bit, we didn't lose a ton of money, but fast forward to 2020, and yeah, the denominator grew fairly substantially from 135 to 222, but that numerator went to 601. So 601 million out net for 222 taken in. It's about $3 out for every dollar taken in from the insurance company. And, you know, one of the main reasons for that is what we're here to talk about today. So I will leave it at that. And, but I can give some further insight into what we saw just overall quarter by quarter in terms of loss ratios affecting the insurance industry. But a lot of the dollars out are driven by ransomware.
Yeah. So are you, because of seeing these, you know, slight losses within the industry, does that mean that you're then putting into force certain requirements to get a cyber insurance policy? Do you see those changing? Are they increasing at all?
Yeah. So when the numbers for 2020 first came out, my initial reaction was, we don't have just a pricing problem. We have more of a systemic issue here on controls. You know, throwing price at the market, at the insurance market, is just a Band-Aid on a flesh wound. It's not going to solve anything. You know, even though we've seen the loss ratios themselves start to come back a little bit more down to earth, you know, the fact that you're $3 out for every dollar in, the insurance community is not we're not nonprofits. I don't think we try and pretend to be at any point in time. Rate is coming into the market, demand is increasing, supply of capital is going down. What the result of that is because of all of the losses, insurers are looking at how they can protect their own balance sheets. A lot of that is through underwriting requirements. So what used to be insurable, I would argue, should never have been insurable. We made a number of changes to our own underwriting a couple of years ago, and we still take losses. There's no silver bullet here, but hygiene, cyber hygiene is a bare minimum now to procuring an insurance policy. So, and I know we'll get into some of these things, but multi-factor authentication for remote access and email access, employee and staff training for everyone, and the ability to retrain those who fail the training. And then looking and doing a deeper dive on backups, on the resiliency elements that we know that make a difference, because you're not going to prevent 100% of items getting in. It's just how do you handle it and how do you minimize it? And what we're looking at is, okay, if again, the old analogy of, it's like getting chased by a bear, just don't be the slowest. But at the same time, we're looking at, okay, if you do get hit, how do you recover? And what is your resiliency plan? And because we're not going to stop frequency, but if we can limit the severity impact of these claims, then we're in a much better position long-term to make this a more sustainable right. Because right now, if we keep trending in Canada the way that we are, this will not be an insurable. It won't be insurable. Canada won't. We are losing. We are an opportunity cost loss to international underwriters right now. They get more money focusing on the same risk in a different jurisdiction in the US or the UK, Israel, Australia. Our rates are far lower than anybody else, and our loss ratios are underperforming other markets. And so if we're not careful, the investment coming into Canada in the form of insurance capital for cyber is going to be very challenged. It already is. And as a direct result of that, we're starting to see a massive price increase across the board, which we're about a year behind.
Amazing. So Dwayne, based on what Greg was saying about having multi-factor authentication installed on your emails and outbound logins and things like that, but also having training and things in place, could you give us some insight into what people can do, how they can set that up on their system so that they at least have some sort of minimal level of security before looking at taking out a cyber insurance policy?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not the expert on what the requirements are to get insurance and stuff, but we've definitely heard from many of companies like Greg that the requirements to even get insurance are, the people are starting to put a minimum sort of level of security, like I said, hygiene in place, right? Multi-factor authentication is definitely a big one. Out-of-bound backups is definitely a big one. Multi-factor on remote logons, good patching processes and stuff. Like most breaches happen from an open vulnerability, whether it's on the operating system or even at firewall VPN type connection, right? We see that lots. Open RDP or brute force RDP, I think it's still number one way to get in. Phishing email is a very close number two. I would say, at least on our experience, more of the breaches we see are sort of victims of opportunity, right? I would argue not many are actual true hard targeted attacks. They're just scanning the ports. We see it lots. And they'll find, like I say, an open RDP, and there they go. So there's, and I don't want to not here to necessarily put a plug for our company, but if they do want to reach out to us, we do have like VPSO services that can work with companies to go through their whole security posture and stuff, top to bottom. But there is some basic core fundamentals that companies can do that would get them leaps and bounds. And it's it's somewhat frustrating because we see the same thing over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I mean, I know from our side of things as well, we've even seen people get hit, claim through their insurance, and then get hit again. So if you were, say, uninsurable in that sense, then Dwayne, is there anything that people could do other than getting cyber insurance policy?
Yeah, I mean, and we're definitely seeing an uptick on this, right? As Greg alluded to, that the insurance carriers have taken a beating in the last couple of years. They're getting more stringent on who will get either insurance, like new policies, cyber insurance, new policies, or in many cases, we've seen them not getting renewed. And the result of that is we're actually getting an influx of incident response retainers. Now, Greg gave the analogy of the Band-Aid. This is probably, some bigger bandages than a Band-Aid, I suppose, but it's still not, it doesn't necessarily fix the root of the problem. But we're definitely seeing an uptick on incident response retainers for organizations that have basically not been able to get insurance. And typically it's because they have either some legacy applications without some good mitigating controls tied around them. But for a myriad of reasons, no one wants to touch them, if you will.
And what would a retainer, cover, and can you use, if you don't use the retainer, can you then use that money for other things later on?
Yeah, good question. That's a nice softball plug. Thanks. The way we do it, for sure, right? So we will do it. We basically, so I'll give somebody a quick skinny what that looks like. So when we do get a call in our incident response hotline, we typically would do what we call a scoping call, right? And that's where we ask the client a bunch of questions. They can be an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on the size of the client. We do get a good understanding of the whole, technology footprint, the makeup of the company, things like that. So in an incident response retainer, we take care of a lot of that ahead of time. So we have all the critical requirements that we need sort of already in hand should something happen. And then we basically put a block of time around it. And the way we do it, I'm not sure what necessarily all competitors do, but the way we do it, if you do not use those hours in that time in that retainer, we can convert you to some of our risk management services that you can use proactively, which is probably what the clients ultimately need anyways. And whether that looks like in a risk assessment type services or some penetration testing services, things of that nature, we can convert you over to that. And typically, if you don't need the incident response retainer, you're not throwing good money away, at least.
Oh, fantastic! That's really good information to know. So, Travis, from a legal perspective, could you give us some insight into the differences between, say, public and private sectors within Canada? Are there different notifications and things like that need to be considered if your company has been the victim of a ransomware attack?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Louise. So the private sector regime in Canada, which predominantly is private enterprise engaged in commercial activity, so not government bodies for the most part, falls somewhere between the US and the EU regimes. So in the US, you have each state either has or can enact their own privacy law, and you don't have this overarching federal law to step in that gap. Then you've got the EU, where obviously you have GDPR applying across the region. So Canada's sort of somewhere in the middle. What we have is there's federal legislation. It's the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, big name, but it's known by its acronym, commonly PIPEDA. A lot of people probably would have heard of that. And it's private sector legislation that applies in every province that doesn't have substantially similar legislation. So what does that mean? So you have this federal private sector legislation. It applies everywhere that doesn't have its own legislation provincially that sort of checks a number of boxes to say, okay, this is similar enough that you can have your own legislation. One caveat to that being, obviously, legislators can be slow to amend, to enact, so you don't have amendments taking place step for step. So there are some differences. There's only a few provinces, Alberta, BC, and Quebec, who have substantially similar provincial legislation. I'll talk about what some of the differences are. But what's important for PIPEDA, and again, because it does apply mostly across Canada, as Greg mentioned, back in November of 2018, so 3 years ago, there was an amendment to introduce mandatory notification obligations. So if there's a privacy breach and it reaches the statutory threshold is real risk of significant harm. Now, I'm not going to bore everyone with the minutiae of the test there, but it's actually a pretty low bar in practicality. It sounds somewhat lofty when you hear significant harm, but it is actually a pretty low bar. But the importance of the amendment was beforehand, Alberta was the only jurisdiction that had mandatory notification. So now once you have these changes to PIPEDA, any organization, private sector organization operating in any province other than BC and Quebec, because they have their own legislation that doesn't have mandatory notification obligations. Again, or I said, it doesn't have step-for-step amendments, so they're a little bit behind on that. But everywhere else, or if you've got personal information flowing across provincial borders or internationally, you're falling under PIPEDA and you're now subject to the mandatory notification obligations. So if you've got a breach which rises to that threshold, again, it's pretty low, the Federal Privacy Commissioner has to be notified and affected individuals have to be notified. The amendments introduce fines if you don't follow those obligations, or if there's a more egregious failure to protect personal information. It's honestly somewhat laughable. I mean, compared to the teeth the GDPR has, it's $100,000 is the maximum fine. So it's pretty low, but I think that will change. The federal government proposed to change it under a bill, which has now kind of died, but I think we will probably see changes there relatively soon. So anyways, so that's kind of what the landscape is now. On the private side of things, organizations anywhere other than BC, Quebec are going to be subject to mandatory notification in the event of a breach. Most provinces also have their own health sector or personal health information legislation, and there's public sector legislation which governs things like municipalities, schools, certain utilities like hydro. Separate privacy commissioner that oversees that, provincial privacy commissioners. You've got the federal one who deals with PIPEDA. So there's oftentimes in the event of a breach, you might be dealing with a couple different privacy commissioners. I've done that many times. On the health side, it tends to be more varied because each province typically has its own. Some have mandatory notification in the event of unauthorized access or disclosure. Some don't. On the public side of things, it's really more, the legislation tends to be more about freedom of information, access to information, consent. There isn't really much that deals with what happens in the event of a breach, not many mandatory notification obligations there. So it's really under the private sector side that we sort of see these obligations. And I think for purposes of this discussion, it's probably the most relevant is the private sector side. So what does all this have to do with ransomware? I'm sure you all enjoyed a tour across Canada, stopping in at the various legislation spots along the way. But in my role as breach coach and privacy counsel, whenever we are dealing with potential breach or we do have a security breach and we don't know if it's privacy yet, one of the things we're concerned about, and we rely on people like CyberClan to tell us, is has any information been accessed or exfiltrated as a result? If so, that mandatory notification obligation likely comes in unless you fall into one of these exceptions. It's a BC only company or something. And the requirement is that you notify as soon as possible. So the clock starts ticking right away, and you want to be gathering the information you can, figuring out who you need to notify, and working with the privacy commissioner. And so in the time that I've been practicing in the field, I feel like ransomware has become more prevalent, and at least in my experience, more sophisticated. It's more common now, in my experience at least, for hackers to grab a bunch of data before they drop the ransomware payload and use that as a bargaining chip in the ransom negotiation. I'm sure it's not informed by any insight they have into privacy legislation, but likely assuming that if there's confidential information, that's something they can use to negotiate with. But from a privacy law standpoint, it was a lot easier when the bad guys only cared about making a quick buck or getting into the network, dropping the payload. Now, when you have people who are collecting information, that's when it triggers these privacy law obligations. And so that's immediately when we're dealing with a breach, you start to look at, okay, has any information been compromised here? And then that's where we step on the legal side, and what are the obligations. And I'm finding it's more and more prevalent because you have a lot of hackers who are doing that. Sometimes they claim that they have, and will sort of try to put their feet to the fire and ask for proof of life, and sometimes they don't have it. But it's rare now that I've seen a case where there isn't even an allegation of exfiltration. Often they'll say that, and a lot of times they will have. They might not have anything all that important, but they do try to grab some data before they drop the ransomware. So that's kind of what the landscape looks like in Canada on the legislation side, for the private side anyways. Obviously, in the last 3 years, now you have mandatory notification. the privacy commissioners have been overrun. I mean, a lot of people are, again, I said it's a low bar on the statutory threshold, but some people have been over notifying. They're so backlogged that it often takes months and months to get a response to a report. But it's been a substantial change in the field when you have those obligations, and we will probably see it come in BC and Quebec. Well, Quebec definitely, they just passed legislation, and BC will probably be shortly behind them.
Do you sometimes find that you know, when a company is hit by a ransomware attack, sometimes they'll notify their customers or their clients as well of exfiltration before they even actually know that exfiltration has actually occurred? Is that something that you find every now and again as well?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I've seen posting on the dark web some of the information that they've taken, going to different news sources and saying we have breached this company if they know who it is, and we have their data. And so kind of more of a, as opposed to a sort of a direct going to the people, affected individuals directly, it's sort of a more public and almost an indirect notification of it. But I've definitely seen that as a negotiating, either pay up or we're going to disclose this, or sometimes they just do it anyway to make the company look bad and kind of scramble and try to, put out the fire.
Yeah, from an insurance perspective, we always just say, listen to your breach coach, who's the lawyer. They'll guide you through this. Don't rush to notify. It could make your life difficult long term. And if you're over, if you don't know what's happened and you're telling everybody in advance, it's like you could be creating liability for your organization without even knowing it. So always listen to your lawyers and listen to the breach coach. And before you notify, on an insurance perspective, all of the policies have consent provisions anyway. So before spending anybody else's money, just ask for permission. It's the way we operate. Yeah, listen to the lawyers. It's a good thing.
It only takes one click of a button from a marketing bod like myself for it to all be screwed up.
That kind of ties in. I was saying the sort of over notification that we're seeing here. The privacy commissioners just being bombarded with these because it sort of defaults to, okay, we'll just notify. But there's a risk inherent in that, right? Especially if you're dealing with a large scale breach, you have to be thinking about litigation risk. And obviously, once people are notified, so it's obviously that's what we do is analyze, what we advise, what we think the legal obligation is, and not just default to, okay, notify or post something on your website. I mean, obviously, if that's a requirement, we do that and do it, sufficiently, make sure that there's as much information as possible, try to make the company, it look in the best light, but it's not always just, okay, notify, there has to be analysis. And again, when I said before, when you had a lot of people just sort of dropping the ransomware, if we had good forensics that clearly indicate there's no privacy breach, I'm very comfortable going to bat against the privacy commissioner here and saying, there's no evidence here that there's been a privacy breach, security breach, sure. And so there wasn't an obligation to notify. And so that becomes a bit more difficult when there is obviously, once there's proof of exfiltration of data that's personal information. At that point, you're toast there. You're obligated to notify.
Yeah. So, Dwayne, from an IR perspective, it can actually take some time, in fact, to actually work out whether any data has actually been exfiltrated, can't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, unfortunately, like as sort of Travis was going to, a lot of this is all about leverage on the client, right? Which is why they steal the data in the first place. They are getting significantly better about trying to cover their tracks. So you can't. It basically puts the ball back in their court, if you will. So deleting, backups is a good one. Like they're deleting logs where possible, on the servers themselves and firewalls, for example, sometimes. So yeah, they do a pretty good job around destroying what bit of evidence we may have to try to definitively state whether or not exfiltration happened. A lot of the tools and stuff that the threat action stuff are using these days do operate in memory as well. So unfortunately, like I say, we get a lot of calls after something's already happened, right? And the client may turn around and reboot or shut down a bunch of computers. So any of that forensic evidence that would have been operating in memory is now lost potentially, right? So it is getting tougher and tougher for sure to try to definitively say yay or nay. And I know this is kind of specifically about Canada. One thing I would say, just because we have teams in the US and in UK and stuff as well, that in England, where obviously you reside, Louise, we at least in our experience, we're actually doing less negotiations with the threat actor than we do in Canada, for example, right? Just as, you know, to differentiate the two regions. It actually helps us a bit, even if there's no intention of paying the ransom, but to actually negotiate with the threat actor, to have that sort of conversation, to try to get the proof of life. And it actually does help us. And sometimes if we do go to the point of where we're paying the ransom demand, some of the nice guys actually give us little security reports of how they got in and what they did and stuff, which is kind of handy, makes our life easier. Yeah, it's getting tougher and tougher to answer your question, though, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest thing, isn't it, really? Because if they're deleting logs, then you don't know how long they've been in the system, in the network in the first place, how long they've been hanging around, where they moved from to, and all of that sort of stuff. But then by not having offline backups or outbound backups, it means it's much easier for them to do that extra damage that requires then for the ransom to be paid, doesn't it? Because otherwise you're not going to get that data back. Yeah. So yes, even more reason to keep your backups offline and make sure that they're as up to date as possible. So Travis, something else that we discussed in our call leading up to this webinar was that you've seen within Canada a rise in class action lawsuits from those, you know, people who have had their data stolen, you know, customers of these companies that have been hit. Could you give us some more insight into that?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I would say this isn't necessarily a new trend, but one which is sort of rapidly developing, and that's class actions in the wake of a large scale data breach. So there's actually quite an absence of case law. There's only one case that's been dealt with on the merits for a data breach class action. That was a Quebec case called Lamoureux. It was a pretty discrete issue. It was an IROC inspector who left a laptop on a train. And so that case actually did get certified, went to trial, but it was dismissed because there was no proof of damages. There was no proof that that information had actually been accessed. There was no proof of any damages. So again, somewhat discrete there. So the remaining decisions that we have across Canada mostly deal with certification, which is the kind of the gatekeeper function to, before a proposed class action becomes a live case, you have to go through the certification process. And that's what most of the decisions are. And so we're kind of waiting to see what, you know, hopefully some of these actually go through to the trial phase and actually get some decisions on the merits. But I think one of sort of the driving forces, well, I mean, I guess the fact that we don't have a lot of decisions on merits hasn't deterred class counsel, because we do see, I mean, it's now almost inevitability. If you have a large scale breach, a class action or multiple class actions in each province is basically going to happen. And I think one of the sort of driving forces of that is, I think all provinces, certainly Ontario, recognizes the tort of intrusion upon seclusion. We've recognized this for 10 years now, so it's not anything particularly new. But it was first recognized as states in Canada followed suit. And so what that is, it's an intentional intrusion into the privacy, personal affairs of another person. And so the reason that this is sort of so amenable to class actions and data breach class actions is it's unlike other causes of action like negligence, because you don't have to prove damages. So the case which recognized the tort in Ontario, at least, capped the damages at $20,000. And that was back in 2012. So, I mean, that's not a big number, but you can sort of see why it's amenable to class actions and why it's intriguing for class counsel. Because if you can have a determination that a company in a data breach has intruded upon the seclusion of the class, $20,000 per person, and if you're dealing with millions of people, it becomes extremely lucrative. It becomes a pretty huge number. So you've had lots of cases where they're sort of trying this, and it's thrown into every data breach class action. Thankfully, on our side of things, it's been pretty tough sledding for class counsel on that. So there was a pretty major blow actually in June of this year. It was a Court of Appeal decision that was dealing with the Equifax breach in 2017. Lower court had certified the intrusion upon seclusion as a common issue. So basically saying this can go ahead and trial as a common issue among the class. Court of Appeal said no. There was no reasonable cause of action there because Equifax was themselves a victim of the breach. So they were hacked, and intrusion upon seclusion requires that intentionality or at least recklessness. So they basically said a company which is a victim here, they couldn't be found liable for that tort. And now there's been a couple of decisions which have followed suit on that in the there's Capital One breach and the TransUnion one as well. So those class actions, same thing, they didn't certify that as a common issue. Now that doesn't stop the class action. There's lots of other causes of action, general negligence and so on and so forth. But it's a real sort of boon for the defense side of things because, again, the concern is not having to prove damages. And most of every other cause of action, as most people know, you have to prove what your damages are. Even if you've wronged somebody, okay, what are your damages? And often in privacy breaches, it's really hard to quantify, and they're often not very high. Like unless there's identity theft, clear identity theft or fraud, if it's just, I've lost my information, it's sort of a mental distress, and there's really not a high number on that. If you've got a big enough class action, the number can get higher, but you can see the class counsel really trying to get this intrusion upon seclusion because they could say, hey, $20,000 for all these people here. So far, it hasn't worked, but that hasn't deterred people from trying. And so until we get, more decisions on the merits, we'll sort of, that will determine, I think, whether the trend will continue. Is this going to be just sort of a inevitability in a large scale breach? Okay, when's the class action coming? Or if they keep getting shot down, it's just not going to be lucrative enough for, you'll need a specific set of facts, I think. It won't just be okay, data breach, we'll go ahead and file a class action. It's just not going to be worth the time and effort. It's big, large scale litigation. And so it requires a lot of resources. And if there's just nothing, if it's not viable, obviously it's not going to keep happening. So on the defense side, we're interested to see sort of what happens with a number of the cases that are out there. Are they going to go ahead on the merits, and what will the decisions be? But at least that's sort of one benefit. And a blow to the prospective class actions is sort of kicking out that one tort. But again, just in terms of a trend, it's been happening in the States, and it is happening here in Canada too. But I can't think of any large scale breach where I haven't seen a class action be filed sort of right after. And and typically if you're notifying, I think there's an assumption, it doesn't hold up legally, but I think there's sort of a perception that if a company is notifying you, it's obligated to protect your information. It's notifying you saying, hey, I didn't do it. So people sort of look at that as an admission of wrongdoing. So you've admitted you didn't do what you're supposed to do. Great, I can now sue you. That's not what the legal standard is anyway, but they keep trying. So we'll see sort of what the way forward looks like. And it is interesting that we have so many of these cases, but because class actions are hard, a lot of them settle. We haven't had a few on the merits yet, but we'll see if that comes down the pipeline over the next few years or so.
So if a class action was brought against a large scale data breach, a company who suffered a large scale data breach, if they were able to prove that they had, a fairly good security posture in place, an EDR installed that was working, that maybe the threat actor was able to bypass, or had security training in place for their employees, or multi-factor authentication set up across their network, I'm guessing that would mean that they've showed that realistically they had everything sort of in place to try and prevent a data breach in the first place. They just got unlucky, and therefore something like this wouldn't actually stick. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, obviously every case is fact specific, and you need a case by case analysis. But certainly if you're talking about just a negligence cause of action, I think you would have a fairly decent defense there to say the company wasn't negligent. They did everything they could up to if it's up to the industry standard, and you look at security patches, and of course you said all the other measures in place. That's the defense that you would put up. I mean, it depends on. If all those things were in place and ostensibly you kind of did everything you could, I think you'd have a pretty good case there to kick out the negligence. And then even if you do get through that, you have to sort of look at the damages, and often it's not very high. But I think that would be a as good a defense as you can have, right? Is to say, because that's the tricky thing with these, right? Is the company who is now dealing with disgruntled clients whose information's been lost is a victim as well, right? I mean, it's not as if they were intentionally, unless you sort of have a rogue, sometimes you have an employee who goes rogue, but that's not the company intentionally trying to misuse your information. They're dealing with an attack themselves. So
yeah,
it's an interesting sort of argument, and this, you can see the limited cases we have, the court kind of wrestling with this. And again, the case that I mentioned, saying, well, they didn't intentionally breach your privacy. I mean, it was, they were victim, whether they were negligent by not doing enough to protect it, but certainly they weren't, there's no intentionality to breach your personal information there.
yeah. So, Greg, if we were looking at this from a claims point of view as well, what is the highest cost for a ransomware claim? Are you seeing the losses more within the business interruption side, the ransom, actually having to pay the ransom, or in things like this with the case of like legal fees for companies being sued in the case of a data breach?
I'm going to give an answer that Travis will appreciate as a lawyer on, and it depends.
Don't say the legal fees.
Yeah.
It's definitely not the IR.
No, we've seen, it's no secret. We've seen the frequency of ransomware cases piling up. Dwayne referred to it earlier in Canada. We are not immune to these types of circumstances and events. And so we've seen a lot more frequency, definitely. The severity impact over the last 2 years has escalated fairly significantly as well. We've seen the attack, the evolution of the attack pattern, like Dwayne alluded to earlier as well, and Travis mentioned too, and creating the privacy related issues for the double extortion tactics as a means to get people back to the negotiating table in the first place. So it's constantly evolving, but anecdotally, yes, demand amounts are going up. In Canada, we've again, knock on wood, but the demand amounts have escalated from tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands into the millions, definitely. And it's not uncommon to see small micro businesses being asked to pay up $2.5 million USD, $4 million USD. Like that's sort of par for the course now, because the threat actors, if they're in and they know they've got you in a compromising position, they're going to ask for what they can ask for. There's a whole lot of implications, but the demand quantum has gone up. So too has the complexity of the situations themselves. And it's why you really need good counsel at the client end, and great forensics support to get you back up and running and out of the mud when something does happen. From an insurance perspective, globally, we've seen demand amounts increase substantially. We know that there are organizations that have paid 40 million USD in demands. Canadian companies have been asked for, in the high 20s again. This is not uncommon. And so to say, hey, we're in Canada, we're nice, nobody's going to go after us, it's a fallacy. It's that it is completely incorrect. In fact, we're one of the highest targeted countries in the world because of what we have. And on top of that, the time for security apathy is behind us. There's no more room for it. Just to tell you, there's no more naive capital in the insurance industry. So you used to be able to transfer your risk with minimal controls. That's not the case anymore. There's minimum hygiene requirements. There's governance requirements that are going to be coming in. It's still a bit of art and science. There's ways of doing just checkups and things like that, which a number of insurers are doing, and bolstering their underwriting tools. But yeah, overall, the evolution of the ransomware market it's gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better, and Canada is not immune to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that insight, Greg.
I see Dwayne wants to say something too, because
I
I want his opinion on this.
Well, yeah, I was going to say something to kind of back you up. And earlier I talked about leverage, right? The bad guys want. One of the big things that we know full well they do is read their insurance policy, and they read a lot of their financials, and often still a lot of financials, but in the insurance policy and stuff as well. So they'll know if you have ransomware coverage, what that coverage amount is, what your deductible and stuff is. So as part of protecting yourself, probably keep that someplace else just to be on the safe side. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw that tidbit out there because we see that a lot, actually.
Yeah, it seems to be a bit of advice we give quite a lot on these webinars, isn't it, Dwayne? Make sure that your insurance policy is saved as a hard copy, probably offline, not on your network, where the threat actor can get hold of it and find out that you've got $2 million in coverage and be able to get hold of that. So yeah, definitely something to consider. If you do have cyber insurance, do make sure that you keep those documents hidden away safely where a threat actor can't actually access them. Thanks a lot for that, Dwayne. I was going to ask as well, Dwayne, is there, from an IR perspective, are you seeing any specific trends in Canada for possibly types of strains people are being hit by when it comes to ransomware, or even industries that are being targeted at all?
Yeah, so well, I think every year in this space is a bit crazy, but it's been another one. We've seen some big groups shut down. We've seen some big groups kind of rebrand, shut down, rebrand, come back up, shut back down again. The two running leaders that we're seeing in Canada, that would be Conti, then Lockbit, are probably kind of the 1 and 2. We see them in England, for example, as compared against that region. It's the same over there as well. So that is the same. I would say, as far as industries, we see a lot in the medical side for sure. A lot. That's probably the number one. But no one is, gets a free pass, unfortunately. And as Greg alluded, absolutely, we're seeing small, 2-store retail type shops getting 7-figure ransom demands, and it's ludicrous. It's mind-boggling how they think that they can get away with it. But they say they take your financials, they take your insurance policy, and if you got a really good one, yeah, they'll go for the limit. But it's a bit mind-boggling in some cases.
In cases like that, where they're small little, retail stores and who aren't necessarily able to pay ransoms of that size and nature, are you able? Are those the sorts of ransom demands that you're, more able to reduce through negotiation?
Yeah. So I would say our experience, at least, the one good silver lining, if you will. I would say in our experience, the larger demand, percentage-wise, the better reduction we typically got, right? So if the demand is $10,000 and you get them down to 9, that's only a 10% sort of reduction. I think most people would rather just get a $10,000 demand, truth be told. But whereas maybe if it's $1 million demand, maybe we can get them down to sub 500, into the low hundreds of thousands sort of thing, right? So percentage-wise, it's better. We look at our stats on a fairly regular basis. I think across all the threat actor groups, all the industries, our sort of running average is in around the 45% at the moment. So it fluctuates a bit, but and sometimes it's interesting. You'll get a new group sort of pop up where we may not have a lot of intel on them, or there's not a lot of intel kind of even in the industry. And it's some guys are, it seems to be the rationale of what they ask, it makes no sense. The rationale of what they will reduce makes no sense. Some guys will go way down, and some guys not at all. Even maybe with the same, quote unquote leverage. So it's it's definitely interesting. I know the team that does this day in and day out. Wow, I think most of them are bald from pulling their hair out so much. So
yeah, and the other thing too is the evolution of whether you can pay the demand or not in the US has advanced significantly in the last little while. You know, the OFAC sanctions list, and now after the Colonial Pipeline incident, you know, the White House is taking a direct interest in some of the in ransomware itself. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in terms of how these things get settled going forward. You know, there's definite concern on the insurance end, because in certain circumstances, it may be able, like it's definitely sometimes the lesser of two evils from a cost standpoint, like from a cost benefit standpoint. If your downtime risk is months and months and months to rebuild your systems, and your limit is X, and you know the demand is 50 grand, then you know it becomes almost a no-brainer for a multi-million-dollar organization. But again, we're never here to pay criminals, and so at the end of the day, you have to explore all options, because you cannot fund terrorism, which this has been labeled as in the United States. And so how does that affect us in Canada? Well, the US is our largest trading partner. A lot of businesses sell into the US. So if all of a sudden you decide as a business owner to pay a ransom, and your insurance company says, well, we can't, because you're a publicly traded US insurance company and they aren't allowed to pay it based on what comes back, then the business itself is making a decision on whether or not they're going to, you know, go ahead with this. And there's long-term implications. Like if you vacation in Florida, maybe you can't do that anymore. You know, there's a whole lot of significant impacts that need to be considered. That a lot, I can tell you just from experience, many business owners do not think about until they are forced to think about them in that situation. And again, I default back to my best piece of advice is, please listen to the lawyers when going through this. They're the breach coach on an insurance policy is always hired on behalf of the client, not the insurance company. So the breach coach is there to help, and they're there to act in the best interest of you as the client, and work alongside the forensics folks, maybe crisis communications folks, but they are the quarterback in these scenarios, and they are a wealth of experience and knowledge, and you know, they're there to help.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. We will be wrapping it up now. We're nearly at time, but before we do end, we've had a question come in from Joel. If we had a rock solid offline backup of everything to get the business operational again, coupled with a strong and tested DR process, what value can we get from cyber insurance policy in the event of a ransomware attack?
Yeah, do you want me to take this one, guys?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, the benefit you get are, and I don't know how everybody else's screen is lining up, but it's the two gentlemen underneath me. I just, you know, what I just finished mentioning on the breach coach being the quarterback and engaging with forensics, there's an element of privilege that gets protected. So if you get hit with a double extortion tactic, and let's say that information is very sensitive, you know, it helps frame your defense, and Travis would be able to walk you through all of the implications surrounding that. But really what again, there's no silver bullet. The best you can do is adhering to hygiene, getting everything done, doing the best you can with the budget that you have as someone in IT and security. But you've got to be right 100% of the time. They only have to be right once. And if they're right once, now you're in a position where you have to deal with it. And having to deal with it, you know, it takes time, it takes collaboration internally and externally, and it costs money. And so the value is still balance sheet protection, it's risk transfer, but it's also access to a swath of experts that can help get you back up and running and out of the weeds as fast as possible.
Yeah, I've certainly dealt with a number of cases where, ransom wasn't required. There was viable backups to restore, but there's certainly a lot of value in having the IR team come in. Oftentimes, they may have done a great investigation internally, but you can have very sophisticated bad guys out there, leave back doors, ways to get back in. I've seen people get hit again. They thought it was clean. So making sure the environment is clean, and then there may be legal obligations as well. I mean, you may not have to pay a ransom, but if there's been personal information accessed, then we can prove that. Or oftentimes, what the privacy commissioner will require is strong evidence to indicate it wasn't accessed. So sort of default to, okay, if we know that the hacker was in an area of your network where there was personal information, unless you can disprove it, we're gonna protect the people at risk here and make you notify. So there could be a whole lot of legal obligations that go with it, even entirely outside of whether or not you pay the ransom. So obviously, hopefully, when I step in and when Quinn does and Greg does, that's the best case from a recovery standpoint, is making sure there's backups. But it's often a long process, and there's a lot of other things that go into it as well that they have to be concerned about. So there's certainly value for those services just outside of whether or not you can keep the business running.
Yeah, anecdotally, we used to be able to get in and get out, and if you restored from backups, the total process of time was definitely under a month, but maybe a couple of weeks, and your costs were, it was like handling a slip and fall case. Your average cost of putting things to rest was about 85, 90 grand, all in, experts, everything. Now that's not the same. The threat vector is much more complex. It takes much longer to deal with these things, and it costs more money. So even in great case scenarios, if there's a complex network structure, a number of terabytes of data to restore from, you're into the hundreds of thousands, and can an organization take on that direct cash impact? That's a question that the finance department needs to liaise with the IT department, who needs to liaise with the HR. And as you can tell, this is something that affects everyone within the organization. This is not just the CFO's issue, nor the IT team's issue, nor the human resources team's issue. This is a business level impact, and it needs to be made a governance related issue, not an IT problem.
Yeah, exactly why IR plans are definitely needed within organizations, because otherwise you're just going to be left scrambling, trying to work out what to do in the event of an attack, aren't you? So we've had a string of questions come in, so we've only got time for a few more before we have to sign off. But one here from Mark: are not the best people to deal with in a negotiation the forensics guys, as they have experience of numerous ransom cases, identifying all relevant indicators such as wallet, demand, ransom strain, etc.? Dwayne?
Sure, we'll be quick because I want to get to kind of David's, but yes, in our experience, we've had the clients do a couple. They want to kind of have a go at it themselves. Only once have I ever been really impressed of the reduction they got. I joked around, let's bring them on board. More often than not, they shoot themselves in the foot, and it ends up costing them more money. It's not the same as doing business, in your regular day-to-day lives. These are criminals, and this is what they do for a living. So I would discourage anybody from having a shot at themselves. And then Mark did also touch on the tracing techniques around Bitcoin, for example. We're actually seeing a pretty big shift away from Bitcoin, from the cryptocurrency flavor of the day, to something like XMR, Monero, that is quote unquote untraceable, or less traceable anyway. So, but yeah, that's what that looks like. But I'm curious to hear the guys talk about David's question.
Yeah, so David, this is our final question before we sign off. David asked, do you think that Canadian firms really understand the damage it does to their brand if they have a cyber attack? Gradually here in the UK, firms are waking up to the fact that an attack has a long-term business effect. So realistically, what David is alluding to is that business interruption doesn't just stop when your systems are restored. Overall, certain elements of this, you will probably lose customers if you suffer a data breach, and that will affect your income long term. So Greg, Travis, what's your input on this one?
Sure, I can start. I think maybe perhaps similarly, I think companies are kind of waking up to it. I mean, you hear about data breaches all the time now in the news. I mean, large scale, and there's so many you don't hear about, but perhaps, in their business circle, they might know someone in the industry who's dealt with it. So I think people are becoming more alive to the risk, and with that, perhaps the effect it has. Maybe sort of going back to the question we had about, what's the benefit if there's no requirement to pay a ransom. I had a case where that actually happened. There was viable backups, didn't have to pay the ransom whatsoever, but the hackers went to some media sources and on the dark web and said, we've breached this company, we've taken their data. And that and it got picked up. There was a CBC article that was done saying, why didn't this company notify? They're not notifying, they're hiding this. And then you're kind of having to explain why and say, and you have a good story, say we did great forensics, there was no indication of compromise. But at that point, you're kind of already behind the 8 ball. There's already this assumption that you're now sort of being nefarious. You're hiding this breach from people. So that can have a huge impact, right? I mean, those stories linger. And if you type in the company name, it's one of the things that pops up as the CBC article. So I think as it becomes more newsworthy and it's happening more and more, I think companies are sort of alive to it, but probably not as much as they should be. And maybe as more companies sort of deal with it on a real, you have these small to medium-sized enterprise think, well, I'm not, a huge company and they're not targeting me. But as they become more aware that you are a target, and that's a huge area that the hackers will hit. And it can have a serious impact if that becomes public, and even just if you have to notify. I mean, there's definitely a lingering effect of having not protected someone's personal information.
Yeah, I would say, and I'll be very quick because I know we're over a minute over time here. I would say focus on the controls, protect what you can. Now is not the time to be apathetic about the security of your business as a business owner, because if you do get hit, and again, you don't have to be a target. Like everybody has said today, you can be a victim of circumstance, but you are still a victim of a crime. And if it comes out that you did nothing about it, then you're in a worse spot than you were even when you got hit. Because at that point, everyone's going to say, okay, well, 1, why didn't you tell us? But 2, why the hell didn't you do something better to protect our information before? And if it goes on the public record, people will start digging into it, like Travis mentioned, in the media. You look at the Alberta Privacy Commissioner's website, you can get a list of everything that's gone on. So once you're on the public record, you've got to be able to explain yourself and justify, like you do in every other element of your business, as to why people trust you with not just their data, but potentially their dollars and their business themselves. So it's security doesn't have to be expensive, but it needs to be enforced.
Excellent. Thank you so much for everything today, guys, and for taking part in our webinar. We hope that you have found what our discussion informative, that's given you some insight into particularly the ransomware landscape in Canada. And yes, if you do have any questions following this webinar, please feel free to contact us at info@cyberclan.com, and we'll make sure that those questions get sent through to the correct participant, so that we can get those answered for you. If you are watching post-webinar, again, please feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to help direct your query to the right person. So yes, thank you very much for joining us today, Dwayne, Greg and Travis. It was a real pleasure to have you talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yep, thanks everyone. Thanks to CyberClan and Dwayne and Travis. Pleasure being up here with you guys.
Well, great.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Thanks, Travis. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Great day.
Bye.
Bye for now.